Welcome to today's lesson, students. In Unit 13 of the Grade 10 Science textbook, we discussed about classification and nomenclature. So, you are familiar with the two main types of classification, natural and artificial. Then under natural classification, which is most accepted one because that shows the evolutionary relationships among organisms as well as shows the natural relationships between organisms of the same species. So, under that, we discuss the three domain classification and the groups of organisms belonging to that and how the classification is in somewhat detail. Thereafter, we discuss the binomial nomenclature. I am sure you all would have answered the questions given in your textbook as well. If not, you all answer the questions first and then you all can listen to my discussion. So, grade 10, unit 13, exercise. The first question, state different classification systems of organisms and the scientists who introduced them. So, when we say different classification systems, you all can remember, students, Aristotle was the first person who introduced a system for classification. After that, it was Carolus Linnaeus who introduced a successful classification that is actually called the Linnean system. Under that only we have the different taxonomical hierarchical levels. Domain, kingdom, phylum, like that we have the different levels. So thereafter it was Robert Whittaker who classified the organisms by 5 kingdom classification method. And then the most accepted scientific classification now, what we use is the 3-domain classification. That is by Carl Woese. So, out of these 4 types of classifications, I will take the last 3 because they are more accepted and those are the systems that we use. So, here the classification system and the scientist. So, here I can say scientific classification by Carolus Linnaeus. This is also known as the Linnean system. Linnean system of classification. Then we have the 5 kingdom classification. That is by Robert Whittaker. Then we have the 3-domain classification. By Carl Woese. So, scientific classification by Carolus Linnaeus, then 5 kingdom classification by Robert Whittaker, 3-domain classification by Carl Woese. So, those are the different systems. I am sure you all also would have written down the same things. We have not discussed this first system in detail, but it is there in your textbook. The name Linnean system is what is given for that particular classification system. That is also referred to as the Linnean system, where we classify the organisms in a hierarchical order. So, if you just write it as scientific classification, that is more than enough. So, that's the first question, students. I will move on to the next one. Compare differences between natural and artificial classification systems. So, you all are familiar with the natural and artificial classification systems. I will use a table. So, we need to compare the natural classification and artificial classification. The two systems of classification. So under that, if we consider the concept used for classification, how do we classify in natural classification? We consider the morphology, physiology, cytology and molecular biological features. Those are the characteristics that are considered for classification. Morphological, physiological, cytological and molecular biological features are used for classification. So what is the characteristics that we use for artificial classification? It is the presence and absence of appendages or habitats. So here we can say presence and absence of appendages, then habitats. These are some of the characteristics used. So that is for artificial classification. Then if we consider the next characteristic, the natural classification, it explains evolutionary relationships among organisms. So here evolutionary relationships among organisms are explained. Whereas the artificial classification does not explain it. Does not explain evolutionary relationship. What is the other difference? In natural classification, the natural relationship among organisms of the same species is explained. Or we can say explains the natural relationships among organisms of the same species. So that is another property of natural classification. It explains the natural relationships among organisms of the same species. Whereas the artificial classification does not explain natural relationships among organisms of the same species. So that is again another difference. Then there is one more relationship. In the natural classification, we use different levels. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So those are known as the taxonomical hierarchical order. So, but that is not seen in artificial classification. So that is another difference that you all have to understand. So in natural classification, there is taxonomical levels of hierarchy used in classification. It is not used in here we can say it is not used. So those are the differences. So if we look at the differences again, natural classification, morphological, physiological, cytological and molecular biological features or characteristics, you can say characteristics also, are used for classification. Whereas artificial presence and absence of appendages or even locomotive appendages, habitats, all these are used for classification. Then the natural classification explains evolutionary relationships among organisms are explained. But the artificial classification does not explain that. Then again the natural classification explains the natural relationships among organisms of the same species. Whereas the artificial classification does not explain that. Then there is taxonomical levels of hierarchy used in classification in the natural classification, whereas it is not used in the artificial classification. So I am sure students, even you all would have tabulated or at least written all these differences between natural classification and artificial classification. So with that, I will move on to the next question. Question number 3. State 3 domains and organisms that belong to them. State 3 domains and organisms belong to them. They have given you the domains and organisms. So since the label is given as domain, you can either just write the name of the domain or you can again rewrite it as domain archaea, domain bacteria and domain eukarya. So I will write it as domain archaea. What are the organisms? Those are the methanogens and halophiles. Then we have domain bacteria. That is bacteria and what are the other organisms? Cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria. Then we have domain eukarya. What are the organisms under domain eukarya? First one is kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista includes protozoans and algae. Since they have asked for organisms, you can either say protist or I will better write it as protozoans and algae. So here we have protozoans, algae. Then under kingdom fungi, there is only fungus, or you can say fungi, plural. Then under kingdom Plantae, we have all the plants. And under kingdom Animalia, we have all the animals. So protozoans, algae, fungi, plants and animals, all of them belong to domain Eukarya. So we have written the 3 domains and the organisms that belong to all these 3 domains. So I am sure students, you all also wrote this correctly. So with that, I will move on to the next question. State the uses of the coral reefs, which is the creation of an organism that belongs to phylum Cnidaria. So you all know the coral polyps. Those are polyps. They belong to phylum Cnidaria and they are very, very useful to us. What are the uses? You all can remember students, they are important for the survival of aquatic organisms. So that is one use. They are important for the existence of aquatic organisms. Then I mentioned another importance. They reduce the speed of sea waves. Normally with water waves, sea waves, soil can get eroded. You would have seen that when you go to the beach, when you stand on the beach side, the waves come and along when going back, they take a little amount of sand with them. But if there are coral reefs, they reduce the speed of the sea wave. Because of that, they help to reduce the soil erosion by sea. That is another advantage. They reduce the speed of sea waves and help to reduce soil erosion. Another importance, you all saw videos of coral polyps or coral reefs. They are very, very beautiful. Sometimes we travel in glass boats to observe these coral reefs. So that's because it's very beautiful. So they provide beauty to nature or the environment. So here we can say they provide beauty to the natural environment. So because of that, it actually helps in tourism industry also. So that's an advantage for us as well. One thing, the beauty of it, even we can admire, and also it becomes a tourist attraction. Another thing, these coral reefs, the coral polyps, that is made up of calcium carbonate. So you can obtain calcium carbonate from the coral polyps. But for that, if we destroy the coral polyps, then it might become harmful to the environment. So I will leave it at this point where we have discussed the uses of coral reefs, which is a creation of an organism belong to phylum Cnidaria. They are important for the existence of aquatic organisms. They reduce the speed of sea waves and help to reduce and help to reduce soil erosion. They provide beauty to the natural environment. So, I am sure you all also would have written some similar answers. So, with that students, I will move on to the next slide. This is the last question. Classify below mammals using a tree diagram. Now, you all are familiar with tree diagrams and dichotomous keys. If you use the dichotomous key, you have to say something is present and that is absent. So, you can only divide it into two. But a tree diagram, you can sometimes divide it into more than two branches also. So, I will use a classification like that to divide these organisms. So, classify below mammals. All of these are mammals. So, if we consider the characteristics, most of them are going to be similar. All the common features of mammals. They will have the female organisms will have a mammary gland. They will nourish their young with milk. They will have an external earlobe. Then they will have red blood cells which are biconcave in shape. Like that, they will have similar features. Hair on skin, different glands, mammary glands, sebaceous glands, wet glands, all those are features of mammals. So, we will have to find some other characteristic that can be used to classify them. So, if we look at the organisms, bat, whale, monkey, rat and bear. Now, the bats, how do they move? Locomotion. They fly. They have wings. Whereas whale, it swims. It has flippers. To swim, it lives in water. Then monkey, they have legs. Rat has legs and bear also has legs. So, based on the appendages used by these organisms, we can classify them into three groups. Or else, we can consider their habitat. If we consider the habitat, then whale will go into the aquatic habitat or sea and all the other organisms will come on to land. But I will use the first criteria that I told you. So, here we have the organisms, bat, whale, monkey, rat and bear. What can we do to classify? You can divide it into three subgroups. So, here I can say use wings for locomotion. Here I can say use flippers for locomotion. Then on this side, use legs for locomotion. What are the organisms? Use wings for locomotion. It is bat. Locomotion, so it's bat. Then we have use flippers for locomotion, whale. And use legs for locomotion, we have the monkey, rat and bear. So, these two have been classified into two groups. Then we have to classify those organisms. How can we classify them? Monkey, rat and bear. Now, we can consider their habitat. If we consider the habitat, all of them live on land. Although monkeys can climb trees, even bears can climb trees, rats also can climb, but normally they live underground. So, that is not a very suitable property to classify them. Then, how about the time that they are acting during the active in their lifestyle, whether they are day animals or night animals, diurnal animals or nocturnal animals. When we say diurnal animals, they are active during the daytime. Nocturnal animals are usually active during the night time. So here, monkey and bear, they are usually active during daytime, whereas rats are active during the night time more. That's the normal trend, but there can be exceptions. So if we take that character, we can divide it as two characters. So we can say active during daytime, and here active during night time or night. So what are the organisms? Here we will have monkey and we will have bear. Then active during night time, it's going to be rats. Then how can we classify monkey and bear? Obvious, you would have seen them and you can classify them in different ways. I will consider the shape of their nose. Normally monkeys have a somewhat flat nose, but bears have an long nose which is called the muzzle. So based on that characteristic also we can classify them. So I will classify these two organisms has a flat nose. Here we can say has a long muzzle. That is the structure in front, in their face. So under that we will have the two organisms. This is monkey and here we have bear. So we had to classify until we come to just one organism, similar to dichotomous key. So if you go back and check, bat, whale, monkey, rat and bear, we classify them based on the appendages possessed by for locomotion. So using wings for locomotion, bat. Use flippers for locomotion, whale. Use legs for locomotion, monkey, rat and bear. Then we have the activity during daytime and night time. If we consider monkey, rat and bear, active during daytime, it's monkey and bear. Active during night time, it's rat. And then we needed to classify monkey and bear. Monkey has a flat nose and it has a long muzzle, that is bear. So these are some features that I use to classify this organism. But as you know, as we have discussed before, each one of you all would have classified these organisms based on different characteristics. Even if you use these same characteristics, maybe you would have changed the order. So that is the disadvantage of artificial classification. When we use presence and absence of appendages or the habitat, then it becomes a problem. Okay, students. So with this, I have completed the questions in your exercise book. So I will end the chapter here, and in the next chapter, I will discuss some extra questions with you all.